So welcome back to the Forensic Focus podcast. I'm Desi, and this week Si and I are talking to Alex Tilley. He's currently part of the Counter Threat Unit at Secureworks. And I recently saw Alex do a presentation on the history of financial cybercrime and wanted to bring him on to bring his presentation to you all. So welcome, Alex, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess we generally see that people take non-traditional pathways by today's standard, at least, like with all the degrees and everything out there with cybersecurity. So I wanted to start with maybe just a little bit of background about yourself and kind of how you ended up in the role that you're in with Secureworks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a philosophy degree dropout. I think I did about a year and a half of a philosophy degree and got out of school and didn't quite gel with me, the university thing. So then my dad is was an old telecom engineer and an old satellite engineer. So he knew a guy who was starting up the Cisco CCNA course the very first time they ran in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
And he was like, "Do you want to do that?" And I was like, "Yeah, actually, it's could be a bit of fun." So yeah, so I did that. And then I managed to jag a job at online casino on the Gold Coast.
Right.
So it was interesting. It was back when it was still legal to do online casinos. And I was a young kid, about 18 years old, doing shift work, driving an hour each way at 6 a.m. It was looking back, it was a bit of a crazy time. But then so that was doing sort of just standard desktop support, but also security stuff. And I really enjoyed the security bit. That was back when ISS Real Secure was a thing. I'm not sure if it's still a thing now, but yeah, so monitoring that. And then the government in their wisdom decided that it was too easy to gamble online and shut them down. So I'll give you the quick version. I went with my girlfriend at the time to Ireland, lived in Dublin for a year doing similar things, running internet cafes, came back and started working in banks. And then, just sort of worked my way up from the service desk to the network security team. I've always been a bit of a network nerd. Then started doing network security. And then basically when phishing started, I was sort of in the security function. So we started responding to phishing attacks, which then, as through the presentation, phishing attacks turned into malware attacks. And then I was working a lot with the AFP, the old high-tech crime center.
Yeah.
And they basically said, "Hey, do you want to move to Melbourne and we'll set up a team around you and we'll do, financial crime stuff online?" And I said, yeah. And then that was it. Basically went to Melbourne and basically we did all the big breaches. We did bottled domains, we did distribute IT, we did a bunch of other large scale breaches in Australia back in the last 10, 15 years. And then, after a little while, you sort of, as most people do in government, you realize, okay, this is great. And I love it. And I love my team. And I love the work, but this is what I'm going to be doing now until I decide to leave.
Yeah.
I had worked with the Secureworks CTU for a long time. And I knew that they did a lot of work with government and law enforcement. And I was like, and they offered me a role, and I was like, all right, cool, I'll take it. So here I am. I often get asked, sort of to talk about career paths and stuff. And mine's been a bit of a funny one, a bit of a weird one, but I seem to have sort of keep backing myself into niches, and I find more and more tight corners to back myself into. But so far it's working out for me.
Let's hope you never realize you're just like, wait, I don't really want to do this. And then you're just like,
there's no way out anymore. Yeah. I only know how to do one thing. Yeah.
Well, that genuinely is a thing that I've said to people. I'm sort of like, if I don't do this is all I can do. I don't have any other skills. Sort of looking around going, okay, maybe I'll dabble in woodworking or I'll dabble in this or that or something, because this is all I know.
I mean, it might be a little bit tough, but maybe you could get some credits for that philosophy degree and just polish that off.
Yeah, I did. I did some work with the university back when I was with AFP, and they sort of offered me a not honorary, but they offered me a spot to do a master's degree or a PhD with them as well. And I sort of said, "Oh, well, can I get RPL?" And they were like, "Oh, a 15-year-old." A third completed philosophy degree doesn't really sit with what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, that's fair. So I'm interested when you started with the banks, did you see the same kind of thing that happened with the IT industry? Is that they kind of right at the beginning they didn't really have security functions, or did you kind of see that from when you joined, the banks had kind of IT security built in from the start?
They had security functions, but back in those days, security was largely a policy sort of function.
Yeah.
And it was sort of giving advice to projects and stuff like that, and dealing with regulatory requirements around, scheduling pen tests and that sort of stuff. But largely, it was sort of more of a policy function. Obviously, someone had to drive the AV consoles, and someone had to drive the spam consoles and that sort of stuff. But yeah, most of the work was around sort of project work until phishing started happening, and then it was like, oh, okay, we need to specialize pretty quick. So this is the right man at the right time, right?
Yeah. So I suppose that's a really good point to dive into, I guess, the presentation that I saw you do, which is, I guess you kind of structured your talk around loss per event and how that was structured. So maybe you could just start us off with, I guess, the low end of the loss per event and then go from there.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I structured it that way because I was trying to figure out how to structure it, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like, okay, so I've got this big story to tell. How do I actually tell this story in a way that's cohesive and makes sense, and people can sort of, I sort of want people to understand how we got to where we are now. Mm-hmm. And so the way that I sort of did that was I started with, okay, well, the initial phishing attacks were maybe $300 to $500 that you would lose as a bank per phishing attack, because the current really modern, which we'll get to, the modern sort of money laundering pipeline simply didn't exist. And I sort of wanted to sort of, get people to understand that we didn't have the technology that we have today. Even though it was only 20, 25 years ago, we were still dealing with spreadsheets and Notepad. You know what I mean? We weren't dealing with these lovely analytical systems and seams and Splunks and all that sort of stuff. It was very much a manual process. Even fraud detection at some banks was still very much a manual process. So when the bad guys started attacking with phishing and then moving into malware, it was a real arms race to try and skill up. How do you do a phishing site takedown? No one knew, because no one had done it before. How do you actually do this? Who do you talk to get a domain, NX domain? Who do you talk to get content from a phishing site? This is stuff that we learnt literally day to day. Now it seems like it's so simple and basic, but for us it was just like, okay, what are we going to do here, guys? Let's figure this out. And the Australian banking industry, we all work together. People like myself at the banks were like sharing notes and on how we were doing things and that sort of stuff, and which vendors we could talk to try and help us out, because even that stuff didn't really exist at the time. There wasn't really phishing takedown as a service, didn't really exist. You were sort of on your own.
Yeah. So I remember you talking in your presentation. So the takedowns, like at the beginning, timing was pretty critical in getting stuff down. So I think you said, like, if you couldn't get it down within a certain time, you were just like not bothering, because there was kind of like a peak of activity from the attackers, and then they'd tail off. And if you missed that peak, then there wasn't a point.
Yeah, 100%. It's sort of a lot of when people started to finally realize that this is a big problem, it's not going away, and people started to research it and understand how it worked. It sort of seemed to be around the 4-hour mark from start of business. So you had about 4 hours from about 7:30 a.m. before. Basically, there's a big peak in the number of users logging into it and sharing their credentials, and then it tails off to almost nothing after about lunchtime. So yeah, you're right. Once you get to about lunchtime, if you haven't got it taken down, move on to the next one, and sort of you still burble along on it, try and get it taken down, but its damage has really been done already by that stage.
Yeah.
Is that just human nature for people coming in and logging in first thing in the morning to do their banking, and therefore you're seeing the same peak on the phishing site as you see on your own internal sites?
It seems to be the way. Yeah, that was the prevailing understanding, was that people were logging in, sitting down, checking their emails, and then they'd log into the phishing sites. That was the prevailing theory at the time, and I think it stands up. I think now with the benefit of hindsight, we can sort of see that it's a pretty quick from log in to click email to move on to with your day. I think it still fits. But I think that even as the bad guys, that sort of tailed off as they sort of realized they could do a whole lot more if they didn't just rely on that 4-hour window.
And did you see, so I guess like later on, we'll talk about kind of the big players in the game that you were kind of tracking, but did you see kind of any criminal activity that you think was coming from Australia and New Zealand at the time, kind of targeting Australian banks, or was it more kind of just foreign criminal or foreign cyber criminals that were just having a broad net, and Australia was just kind of hit in that attack as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that sort of comes up time and time again. And I don't have any hard numbers on it, but more and more when I look at the latest and greatest attacks, there does seem to be a real bent to target Australia first. Now, my theory on that is that we're a relatively wealthy nation. We've got relatively advanced fraud detection and, anti-crime sort of infrastructure. And we do have a really well set up way to move money out of the country. And I think that's why it appears to me that we're a bit of a test bed, and other people seem to agree that you see the new stuff and it's like, well, why is that targeting Australia? And it's like, well, I guess we're as good as anyone. And you want to sort of practice it here and get good at it here, and then you move on to the UK and Europe and the US is the sort of theory that I have. Yeah.
And I suppose, like, how, from what you've seen, are they still targeting us and using it as a test bed, potentially because, like, the information sharing and communication channels weren't always good and we were smaller?
Yeah, I think we're small enough that they can hit a bunch of our brands at once easily. We don't have to worry about, the US has got thousands and thousands and thousands of different banks and financial institutions. Australia's got a relatively small community of them, and the UK is obviously tied in really tightly with Europe, so it sort of gets a bit interesting there as well. So I think we're relatively siloed in that respect. So if you can try it here, and also our banks have very advanced fraud detection, as I said, and malware detection systems, but also really fully functional internet banking and phone banking, which means that if you can work it here, it's going to work anywhere, is basically the idea.
Cool. Yeah. So I suppose, like right at the beginning, you said that kind of banks were buying into security quite heavily, and the work that your team was doing and taking all this stuff down, like still in that $500 mark, was because they were really pushing the confidence in the channel, is what you called it. So I was wondering, maybe you could just explain that and touch on that a little bit just for the listeners.
Yeah, no problem at all. It's an interesting one that people don't seem to consider a lot, is that, everyone likes to sit there and bash the banks. Obviously, that's sort of a sport for Australians, but the banks actually spend an awful lot of money and resources trying to protect your money, which is also their money, if that makes sense. So at the time, it was really, okay, we need to up this game because we're bringing in this brand new thing at the time called internet banking. And we want people to use internet banking because it's more convenient, and they want how to use it, and it's ultimately going to be cheaper if they use it, that sort of stuff. So the level of panic around people losing confidence in what was a burgeoning channel, like internet banking, was brand new, so people were still a bit leery about it. So it was about, listen, we're investing heavily in security to secure ourselves and your money, but if you want the convenience, there is going to be some risks. We'll do our very, very best to help subvert those risks and mitigate those risks, but that does exist, but you don't really want to talk about it.
I think I remember in your presentation, it was just like cents compared to, like, I forget what it was, but it seemed like a big difference between going into a branch and doing your transactions and online banking, which is kind of seemed why they were pushing that.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of inside knowledge that I don't think the banks like me talking about. But yeah, it's like it's ultimately cheaper if you use internet banking than it is if you walk into a bank branch and demand to have a teller in front of you giving you some sort of service. So yeah, there's ultimately that. So that was why. And plus, people wanted it. That was the other thing. Like, we were doing these surveys and we're talking to our customers, know your customer, but it became the watchword around that time. It was like, understand your customers' wants and needs and that sort of stuff. So it became that watchword, and it was about, what do you want? Well, I want, fast transactions. I want access to it wherever I go. I don't want to have to go into a branch. And it's like, okay, we'll build you this platform, which means that you can use that, which ultimately will save a bit of money. It's going to cost us money to implement it. But we also now need to understand how to secure this damn thing. And then, we move through into, like, instant payments and then offshore transactions. And as, it evolves, and as people, what they want to do evolves, the banking industry has to keep up with that and try and balance security with functionality, right? That's the whole thing.
And it's somewhat self-evident, isn't it? I mean, you've got a large building that costs money in the middle of a town centre, and I mean, it's contentious in the UK because there are people who like going into a bank and talking to people still, and the fact that they're getting shut down is a contentious point. But yeah, I mean, it is obviously logical. We shop online, we bank online, we do pretty much everything online except for going to the supermarket to poke a tomato before we buy it, and that's about
Right.
it. I mean, there are
Yeah.
people who do that too, online. Not the poking part, the buying part.
You go into bank branches even here in Melbourne now, and it's a very different experience. They're almost like, what are you doing here? What's going on?
Well, I found that if I turn up to a branch in the UK, they quite often point me to the ATM.
Yeah.
And say you can do everything on that. It's like, well, if I came in here, it's obviously something I can't do on that. But but yeah, it's a
Well, I had a bank. I was talking to a bank. I was moving my mortgage over, and the guy was like, "Oh, you can't. You don't want to go with that lender because they haven't got any bricks and mortar banks, and they're not a full-time bank, and they haven't got facilities." And I said, "Okay, cool. But also, well, I got you. I want to cancel this credit card. Can I go into the branch and cancel this credit card?" And he said, "No, you do that online." And I was like, "Well, what am I actually missing out on here?"
Yeah. All right. So I guess moving on from the initial wave of attacks and phishing that you were seeing with the banks, you kind of then dove into the 5,000 per transaction limit that you were seeing. So I guess you saw a bit of an evolution there. So maybe you could just talk about some of the technical details around that and what you were seeing.
Yeah, 100%. So that was so around that time, which is about maybe 2003, 2004, 2005-ish, let's say.
Yeah.
We saw a real shift because I think we were getting quite successful at getting things taken down. It was whack-a-mole, and you had, it was a constant thing, but we were not bad at it. And we sort of had by that stage, we built some systems, we had some scripts, and things would help. But then what happened was this thing called Rockfish emerged. Now, Rockfish really changed the game as far as phishing was concerned. So Rockfish was what you would call like the first automated large-scale multi-victim phishing apparatus. It was probably one of the first real crime apparatuses that we saw being developed for online cybercrime, financial-based cybercrime. And it was really basically, the idea of it was they were using reverse proxies and had things at arm's length, and then they started to use this stuff that we called, and you'd see 20 bank brands with 400 phishing sites popping up all at once. So then everyone had to scramble to try and get it taken down. And because it was hosted on reverse proxies and maybe even bulletproof hosting, it was hard to get things taken down. It was a real interesting sort of pivot. And you'd see these domains come up, which initially had whatever domain /rock/bank. And then they went to /r1/bank and then /r/bank.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd see that. And as an analyst, you'd sort of panic because it was like, okay, now we got a big attack in our hands.
Yeah.
Can I just ask,
yep.
is it the people who are doing the low-level phishing who have evolved and learned? Or is it just some more organized people realizing that there's an opportunity here and coming in with a different skill set? Do you know which it is?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both. Actually, if I can do a quick plug, I wrote a paper about this that's on our website that sort of goes into a bit of the historical aspects of who was involved with Rockfish and that sort of stuff. It's called the Business Club, but so it's worth a look at if I do say so myself.
No, we'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, so that whole stuff seemed to come out because people realized, hey, we could make some money out of this.
Mm-hmm.
And as that evolved, you started getting things like, not yet commercial mule infrastructure. So mule, for your audience, a mule is like, if you think about like a drug mule who mules drugs, a person who takes drugs from one country to another country.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing is true with money. You have what's called money mules who will move money from one country to another country.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, they sort of started out being, applying for job ads for work from home, that sort of stuff. That was pretty evident through my entire career, was that stuff, but that sort of moved off now. It's much more professional these days with people who know what they're doing involved. But the idea being that, okay, we've got these decent sized criminal bits of infrastructure like RockKit and that sort of stuff. We need to move serious amounts of money because $5,000, funnily enough, back in 2004, it's pretty hard to move $5,000 around the world, genuinely speaking. Like you could do various things to credit cards and foreign exchange offices in Western Union, that sort of stuff. But it really at scale was kind of hard to move that sort of money then. Now it's a whole different story. Now it's got crazy. But the idea being back in the day, yes, like let's hit multiple banks around the world all at once, really hard, and get as much money as we can. So sort of that sort of ratcheted up a bit to that $5,000 using these reverse proxies and things like, you know, your audience can I won't go into too much detail, but you can sort of Google things like Fast-flux or round robin DNS, which helps with hosting things around the world and moving things around so it's harder to take them down via IP address means. That was all coming out as being brand new sort of stuff, because the business, if you will, of cybercrime was starting to understand, hey, there's money here and we can do this.
Yeah, so I suppose that, like, talking about the Fast-flux, so you saw that towards the end of 2005, that kind of when it was kicking in.
Yeah, it's a really simple trick, and these days I suppose we'd call it load balancing or the cloud. I suppose these days. At the time, it was the idea being that you resolve one domain now, and you get 5 IP addresses that are all over the world.
Yeah,
you resolve it in a minute, you get 5 new IP addresses that are all over the world, and so it just bounces through this network of thousands of basically reverse proxies. So it makes IP-based takedowns pretty much impossible, or actually impossible. And then you have the problem of thinking about, okay, well, from a fraud point of view, how do I tell which IP is a bad IP when I've got thousands of IPs all logging into accounts at once? It makes things a bit more difficult. So that was the sort of evolution going forward.
Yeah. And at this point in time, how did you see the blue side or the defender side evolving? Because it seems like initially it was very manual, go contact the provider, take it down, like in that time when it was $500 per transaction. But we're seeing some more like defensive automation in the banks at this stage.
Yeah, rapidly. Definitely around things like what we call simple things now, like things like automated querying of who is, and automated domain scraping and IP scraping, and building databases of that sort of stuff. Like like we sort of think about them today as being bread and butter, but a list of known bad IP addresses at that stage didn't really exist yet. Like we were building them as we went. As you're monitoring these botnets with these fast fluxes, you were adding those IPs to lists to try and build this picture. These days, you have automated systems that emulate botnets and scrape this and that sort of stuff like that. But back in those days, we didn't really have that. But they were coming along rapidly because we had to. Because that's the old adage of if you do something twice, script it. If you do it 3 times, make a program for it.
Exactly.
And we were doing this stuff daily. So various banks had their own different approaches to it, but definitely we were rapidly increasing our understanding and our tooling around this stuff.
Yeah, I know from like other industries. So for example, like the OT industry and even some of the government industry, like you think about state governments and that kind of thing, like information sharing is always hard. Like how did you kind of see, like back in 2006, were the banks really picking up amongst each other to kind of help everyone out, because they would have all been facing the same problem, right?
Yeah, and this is a little bit of inside baseball, but it's that there was an adage that we had at the time, which was there's no competitive advantage in security.
No,
as in we would help each other out to understand the new stuff. And so even back then, when people used to bash the banks, I used to sort of sit there and smile and say, you have no idea. We're working so hard to try and help people here, and everyone's working together, and we're all sharing things and trying to help. Obviously, you'd never share customer data or anything like that, but it'd be around, what we're trying to do here and how we're trying to do that there. And we tried to use this and it didn't quite work, so we pivoted that way. That sort of stuff was, there was there still is, I imagine. But I'm out of banking now, but there was a really good community there of like-minded people who just wanted to help protect customers. And the banks saw the value in that work, obviously, and helped facilitate that sort of sharing, or at least that sort of building of a community, which I was quite proud to be part of for a very long time.
Yeah, because I can imagine like the cyber industry still seems small in Australia, so I imagine that security like group would have been like tiny.
It felt like at some points there was about 12 of us, honestly. I feel like there's probably a lot more now, but at the time it did feel like I had about 12 people that I would contact daily or whatever that I knew I could get to help. So it's at that stage it felt quite small.
Yeah, wow, cool. So I guess like moving on from that, then you the next part of your presentation was, I guess, moving into the $50,000 range.
I took a bit of a jump there, but it was to explain that we had this shift from even now the automated large scale rockfish type phishing attacks to malware, So malware became a thing, and
Yeah.
banker Trojans now are a dime a dozen. You talk about Zeus and Citadel and, you know, Sherlock and NetHell and SpyEye, and that's these sort of names that people sort of seem to understand. But at the time, it was like, what is this thing? Holy crap, it's hooking the web browser. Oh my God, it's harvesting credentials out of the web browser directly. Crikey, what are we going to do? Like, we're still just getting used to dealing with large scale phishing, right? Now, all of a sudden, our customers' web browsers are getting owned and owned at a really large scale. And it was like, that was an evolution. Like, that was a massive evolution in detection for the banks, but also for the bad guys in their activities. So that jump from just phishing to now I'm going to install something on a computer. That was a really bad time in trying to figure that out.
So how, I guess, like from your viewpoint, how do they go about that? Because I guess that's moving it from kind of almost attacking the bank directly to attacking the individual, like installing it on individual workstations. Yeah.
It's and then, like, to go back to the previous discussion we had around the timing, what it does is, one of the big things is it takes that 4 hours out of the loop, right? Now I can get you no matter when you log into your bank, because I own your web browser. So it was a massive pivot, and it made sense looking back historically. It totally makes sense, because that's the next way your place should go. You didn't, because, and also at the same time, things like spam filtering were getting better, right? Like, you had, you know, things, you know, all these companies now were starting to exist that did spam filtering. And I remember my boss back at a bank saying to me, you know, we were looking at outsourcing to a spam filtering company, and I was like, oh, do we really want to do that? And he said, Tilly, are we a bank or are we a spam filtering company? I was like, well, we're a bank. He's like, well, then we'll get rid of the spam filtering. We'll let, you know, and as a network geek, you know, my whole thing was, let the router route, let the firewall, right? Let the switch.
Yeah.
It's the same thing in this sort of technology as well. It's like, get something that does the job as its purpose and let it do it properly.
Yeah. So I guess back then, when this was happening, when it was more browser based, because it's probably security features that I take for granted. So if I like jumped on a plane and went to another country and then tried to transfer money out of my CommBank account, like CommBank could probably go, this is suspicious. Like, you're not meant to be in this country normally. And it kind of flags that and may stop transactions over a certain amount. But I guess, did you see that kind of drive those kind of innovations in online banking security? Yeah,
it was definitely this was the sort of the start of the era of know your customer. And know your customer is a very broad term, but it also encompasses know your customer's workstation, know your customer's browser, know your customer's habits, that sort of stuff. So understanding, because now you understand that, okay, that whole, I can log in from Australia, but then if I log in from the UK within 20 minutes, that's impossible. Like, that sort of analytics are starting to be done, which is now bread and butter. At the time, it was, okay, we need to figure this out. So definitely it was forcing that evolution to try and understand what our customers are doing and where they're going, and what looks strange. Now, the other thing that came in at the same time, and I'm not going to go too much into detail about it, was the anti-money laundering legislation. All of a sudden, there was sanctions, and you had to understand your customer, and you had to do all these things. So that really forced an evolution in detection. Was around, okay, well, now legislatively, I have to understand my customers and where they are, and I have to make sure that I can't transfer money to certain sanctioned countries. So all these things are happening at once, which helped that big evolution from spreadsheets and Notepad to behavioral analytics systems, and all this new cool funky stuff.
I guess that so pushing past, I guess, that starting to do the automation, you push then from 50 into the 500K range, and you've got like Game Over Zeus and Dyer in this stage. So maybe you could talk, like, not too technical, but I guess just a little bit about that whole criminal campaign and what it meant to the banking industry.
For sure. I think at this, so what happened around then is, so up till now, as you said, we've been talking about attacks on the customer, attacks on, what you call retail banking, individual accounts, my account, your account, that sort of stuff, and ways to get money out of that, which does sort of have a bit of a ceiling, right? Because none of us have got that much money. It's sort of got a bit of a ceiling there. What happened after that was, there's this thing, so Zeus, which is the first and the biggest and baddest of the banking Trojans, that morphed into this thing called Game Over Zeus, which was basically Zeus on steroids. Again, not to go too much into technical detail, but they'd rejigged the command and control, and they'd rejigged some of the back ends, and they'd moved things even further to obfuscate the true sources of data and where the infrastructure was. But that and this new thing called Dyer basically started targeting almost entirely, at least in my experience. There's always some crusty malware analyst who's like, well, that's not entirely true, Tilly. There was a variant that did this. I was like, that's fine. But in my experience, they started targeting almost entirely business banking and sort of wealth management and sort of different types of financial institutions and financial. Yeah. So the banks were doing such a good job at detecting and shutting down these retail banking attacks that the bad guys again pivoted and said, okay, well, if we do 10 transactions of 50 grand and 9 get blocked, we don't make that much money. But if we can find a way to do 4 transactions of 500 grand and 2 get through, we're doing real good. You know what I mean? That was sort of thinking. In my experience, that was the thinking. So they sort of pivoted that away from retail banking and mum and dad accounts towards much more robust, well-funded types of accounts, which genuinely made them an awful lot of money. Like there was no messing around anymore. It was quite bad. And again, that was because the banks did such a good job at shutting down a lot of that retail banking stuff that bad guys just had to pivot. And that sort of makes a lot of sense, right? You look where there's money, and then at the same time, you had this evolution of money laundering and cash out pipelines and that sort of stuff happening. So now you can transfer out of the country 500 grand because you've got these mature money laundering networks set up. So everything sort of had matured at the same time to make these attacks not only possible, but really successful. And it all sort of built on the same basic foundation of hooking web browsers and reverse proxies and all this sort of stuff. It was the same basic foundation. They just made it a bit more robust and then fired it through this massive cannon of money.
From there, like you talk about how they pivoted from the customer base where they were making kind of small time money, probably constant, into businesses. And then you spoke about a couple of operations that I think you were a part of, or there's like the AFP with the Russian crime gangs attacks and stuff. So I think the one in the slides you had was Operation Tovar, contributing efforts to pull down Game Over Zeus and Crypto Locker. So I think that was really interesting because that is kind of like a theory that you had with modern day criminals. So
so Operation Tovar. Yeah, Operation Tovar was that was actually Secureworks and the US DOJ. That was before my time at Secureworks, but that was the dismantling. Well, it's Secureworks and some other companies as well, but it was the dismantling of Game Over Zeus. People worked very long and hard to understand how it worked, understand where there could be weak points in it, and then just pressed on the weak points and managed to luckily take it down and largely keep it down. These things always have a bit of a resurgence where they try and come back, but so far it looks like taking it down and keeping it down was successful. It was a tremendous piece of work from lots and lots of people. Operation Tovar is one to definitely look into for your audience to have a look into. I think we've got a blog at Secureworks for our part of it. Sorry, not my part. I wasn't involved, but the part that we did at the time. And I think there's also some US indictments and that sort of stuff floating around that you can read. But it was a brilliant piece of technical work from a lot of people to stop this thing in its tracks because it was so big and so bad. It was, I think it was quite one of the most successful botnet takedowns that was done, really.
Listeners will get to read up about it. We'll link that in the show notes. But I guess Crypto Locker was also found. So
I
think at this point, like ransomware wasn't really a big thing back when Operation Tovar was going on. Isn't that right?
That's correct. So at the time, ransomware wasn't really a thing. And my understanding, and from some of the US DOJ indictments that you can read, they found the source code for this thing called Crypto Locker on one of the servers. And at the time, no one really knew what Crypto Locker was. Like, ransomware didn't really exist. It wasn't a thing. But it genuinely, now, if you look back historically now, it shows that even at that stage, those crooks were getting an idea that, okay, well, hey, how about if we take the banks and the financial institutions out of the equation entirely?
Yeah.
Let's take all these protections that these people have built out of the equation entirely, and let's deal one-on-one with our victims. And it's a much, much more lucrative approach for the bad guys because, the victims' organizations aren't really set up to protect themselves, or at least haven't been. They're getting better. as we're getting more and more knowledge of these things. But yeah, definitely one of those things that sort of takes time. And it to me, it shows that there was that forward thinking by the crooks to sort of understand where to move to next.
Yeah, and it's so clever as well, because like they were honing their skills against banks this entire time, who were sinking like so much money into security. And it's just like it's like having a pro player that spends all their time getting to pro, and then they come back and play junior leagues against just someone who's never played against a pro player before. And they're just like, what is this? Why am I getting hosed so easily?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And it came out of left field. And this at the same time was the sort of explosion of cryptocurrency, right? Which sort of facilitated a lot of this stuff. So now I don't even really need these large money mule networks. I can just get the money directly from the victim.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot more of the detection avenues out of the equation. And it was, it's definitely, it's crooks. So I've got a thing I always talk about, which is that, you do a job for long enough, you get pretty good at it, right? The same thing is true with criminals. You do crime long enough, you learn how to be a better crook. You learn, your bag of tricks or your bag of tools gets bigger and bigger and bigger because you now have this experience. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't give credit to the crooks about, is that, if you stayed out of jail for long enough and you've done enough crimes, you're a pretty good crook. You've learned. And now when something comes along that, like if you're doing a scam, say, and you get involved with let's say a piece of detection software that you haven't seen before, you've got enough in that bag of tools to pivot and try something different to then still get to your aim. You're not going to stop dead because you've got this whole big bag of experience to deal with. And I think we don't give them enough credit from that respect.
That's very true.
Not that I'm saying it's good, but I'm just saying from a criminal point of view.
It's the sort of nature argument, isn't it? Is that, as soon as you invent a mousetrap, the nature will invent a better mouse. It is a constant game that's being played. Is evolution. We evolve, they evolve, we evolve, they evolve. It's non-stop, and we're seeing interesting and innovative innovation. Of course, it's innovative innovation, he says, tautology, innovative solutions to come up against this. And crypto, like you say, when we're protecting the endpoints, or not protecting the endpoints, but protecting the banking infrastructure, taking it to the endpoint becomes the logical thing. You're evolving to do something that's that deals with your current problem set.
Which is why it makes such sense, and which is why I'm comfortable talking about it, even though I am mindful that I don't want to tick off the banks, but I'm comfortable talking about it because to me it shows that they did a really good job. And it's sort of perverted to think of it that way, but it's like, I don't think we'd be where we are now if the banks hadn't done such a good job and put in so much effort and resources over the last 20 years. And that's I think the whole crux of what I'm trying to get across. Is not to say, banks screwed everything up and everything went bad, which is not the case at all. It just means that the bad guys learned as we learned, and as we got better, they got better. And that's just, as you're saying, that's just the nature of things.
But ultimately taking it to the desktop shows that the banks have, kind of succeeded in protecting their assets. If it's not worth going at the bank anymore, you've done your job. Well done.
And it's become a point now where, unfortunately, with ransomware, it's everyone's problem. We did have it nice and sort of, I suppose, contained is one word for it. We had it nice and contained to the financial sector. And we're like, okay, these bad guys that want to steal money, where do you steal money from? Steal money from the financial sector. So it was contained there, and it was the bank's problem, and it was the, wealth managers' problem and the superannuation funds' problem to secure the money. Now it's like, well, no, now it's, that widget factory, it's their problem now, or it's, that pharmacy, it's their problem now. And that's where we're at now. And it's got quite scary because a lot of those places are nowhere near ready to defend themselves. And they just, you have one bad day and your help desk melts down because all your staff can't log into their machines. I've got this funny message on my machine, and then it becomes really real. And it's all of a sudden directly your problem. And that's an interesting world to be in.
Yeah, and it's not, and that lack of targeting again, has caused serious problems in healthcare, where the NHS here got hit, some hospitals in Germany got hit, resulting actually in a death. I believe that you're talking about serious consequences now. I mean, losing money is not an insignificant problem. I haven't got any to spare, but death is kind of a level above, and that push
It's
out
absolutely
obviously
brutal.
is causing that to be
Yeah, it's
true.
and it's brutal. And I speak a fair bit these days. I tend to go through waves of what I speak about a lot. But one thing that I haven't stopped talking about in about the last 7 years is ransomware, funnily enough, because everyone's interested in it. But
Yeah.
it is one of those things where sort of I will talk about it, and I do a lot of work on business preparedness for response. So I sort of talk about, let's not talk about technical means. Let's talk about how the business is going to respond when this bad day happens. And there's a lot of different aspects to that. But invariably when I talk about it, a bunch of hands go up of people who have either lost a business or know someone who's lost their job or whatever to a ransomware attack. It's brutal, and it's by its nature, it's brutal, right? And I think that's what we've got now, is that the walls that the banks put up around your transactions and your savings was so well constructed, and over time, because it had to be, all of a sudden now, all these companies just leaving the front door open and they're getting punched in the head via it, and it's terrible.
Yeah. And especially, I guess, with the shift of like even ransomware over maybe the last decade, even less, has shifted from not just encrypting the data, but exfiltrating and then extorting, which like in Australia is a very hot topic at the moment with the current Optus breach, like being millions of Australians' data out there and then having to clean that up and potentially at risk for further scams that way. So that's, I guess, another revolution that was a small leap between encrypting to, we can take data as well and then try and extort companies for it. So
yeah, and I think as a bad guy, if you've got enough access to encrypt the workstations, they just realize, wait a minute, we can steal this stuff as well. This is great. We're already here. We may as well just take it. And I think what it does is it, like a ransomware attack, if you're a victim, is it's a pain-based attack, right? It hurts a lot. It really, really hurts, that attack. But what we've seen now with this name and shame stuff and the exfiltration is there's now pressure. So you're bundling up this extreme pain of a business being, existentially threatened, basically, with now the pressure of potentially your dirty laundry getting aired, or your mail spool getting dumped, and it's all designed to put that pressure on either the board or the C-levels or whoever's making the decisions to pay, because the pain wasn't enough, and they're like, well, okay, now we can really screw them.
That's it, though. Is that actually you going around and telling people how to prepare so that they've got good backups and they've got disaster recovery plans and they've got offsite systems that aren't connected that they can bring online to deal with stuff, has mitigated the ransomware as ransomware. So they've had to evolve to the next level to do it. So again, you have successfully caused them to evolve. So, it's credit where credit's due. You've done your job. Well done.
Forced an evolution yet again.
And this is it, and that's the evolution now. I don't think there's much further they can go. I hope there's not much further they can go. After that,
we'll see.
I think there's potential to take the ransomware out of the equation entirely. Just use the name and shame. Just use the exfiltration of data and the blackmail around the data. I think sometimes the actual identification of the entire network and deploying of the tool and running the tool and managing the keys is the hardest part of any compromise for ransomware. I think getting the data out and now having the infrastructure set up to name and shame and do the money transfers and all these sort of things, you might not even bother with the encryption anymore. You just go, well, hey, I've got your crown jewels, mate. What are you going to do about it? You might ask for less per event, but it's the same basic attack except for the end bit.
Yeah. That's definitely true in incidents that I've seen before when companies do have quite good backup solutions. Is that it seems like a half-assed effort to encrypt the data. Like they'll just hit one file server maybe, but they've stolen data from 3 or 4 file servers. And then the ransomware is almost just like, hey, we're here and look what we did, and then with the communications, you're like, oh, okay, they've actually taken, and the investigation, of course, they've taken quite a lot more than just the server that they've encrypted.
Yeah, and you're seeing, the event of DDoS being chucked into the thing as well. It's like either pay off or we've ransomwared you, we stole your data, and now we're going to DDoS what's left. It's like, well, what are you going to do, right?
kick them
gets
while they're
interesting.
down is
Yeah,
their
right.
kind of
It's
motto,
all
right?
about pain and pressure. All about pain and pressure.
Awesome. Well, it was really great talking to you this afternoon about your presentation. We've got a few more questions, just a bit more lighthearted to finish off with, and then we'll wrap it up. So I guess
Sounds good.
first one is, what is something that you're excited that you're like got on next? Like maybe it's a presentation or something that you're working on, but what's something that's exciting you coming up?
Genuinely, I think I'm going back to New Zealand in a few weeks. I haven't been there since COVID. I normally would go to
Nice.
New
Yeah.
Zealand every year for KiwiCon and some other stuff that's on over there. And I think I'm going to be going back there. So I'm really excited to see my friends in New Zealand again.
Nice.
Yeah.
Are you gonna be talking at KiwiCon or a conference over there at all?
Yeah, but it's a closed door thing.
Okay.
So,
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
but no, so but I'll be looking forward to that. And while I'm there, I'm running another session here in Australia. So I'm trying to figure out time zones and stuff. So I'm doing my head in a little bit now. But I'm looking forward to seeing my friends in New Zealand for the first time in 3 years.
Nice.
Excellent, good stuff.
That's Si and I, every time we try and organize a podcast, is just working out time zones.
Yeah, which time zone are we in today? Yeah.
Yeah, and I had it organized, and then we went and chucked daylight savings into the mix, and I'm like, wait, did that go forward or backwards? I don't actually know what time.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys are well ahead of us on daylight savings. We haven't got ours till, I don't know, 2-3 weeks hence now.
Yeah, there's this weird period where it's completely out of whack with the UK, and it sort of gets back to a somewhat normal. But yeah, there's this weird period where it's way out.
Yeah. I guess
Thanks for getting up early.
Yeah. What do you do to unwind? What's your kind of downtime, whether that's family, a hobby, Netflix, reading? What do you?
I used to love to read, but now all I do is read. You know what I mean? Like you find you read for a living, pretty much. I honestly, I play with my cats, and that's so boring and so stereotypical. But I just got a couple of cats, and we play with them and sort of just fuss over them, and try and sort of do that. So yeah, that's what I'm doing, and I'm sort of looking at maybe in the future moving back up to Queensland, and I'll be looking forward to having a pool to bob around in, or the beach or something like that. I think Melbourne's I love Melbourne, but it's a bit grey. And after 15 years, I think I'm looking forward to getting back to the blue skies and the heat of Queensland.
Nice. That's coincidence. I'm off to Queensland next year, so I'm currently in South Australia. But yeah, looking forward to getting away. I've been here for 7 years myself, so looking forward to a bit of a change, which will be cool.
Watch out for February. February's a killer.
Yeah, I've heard.
Especially in southeast Queensland, February's a killer.
I guess last one. So do you have any upcoming, I guess, public engagements that people can kind of catch you at if they're out at any conferences or anything?
Yes. I'm just looking at my big whiteboard here. I'm doing, there's a group that I've been involved with since I was back at AFP. It's called SMBiT Pro, which is small, medium business IT professionals. And they're a group of people that I adore that run businesses that help provide services for small and medium business. So their national conference is on the Gold Coast at the end of October. And then if anyone's in Canberra, I'm speaking at ISACA in Canberra on 4th of November. So if you want to come along and say hi, that'd be great. But yeah, so that's sort of the public stuff I got going on. It's going to be a big last part of the year, as it always is.
Yeah. Depending when we release this, we'll chuck those down in the show notes as well if people want to get along and see Alex do a talk.
That SMBiT Pro group, I think they're great. They're just it started out really small. Started going there must have been 10 years ago now, speaking there, and it's just grown and grown and grown as people try and help out small and medium businesses, and they've got a really good network together that sort of help each other. So I'm all about the sharing.
Fantastic.
That's awesome.
It sounds really good. Yeah.
All right. So before we sign off, I guess, Si, do you kind of have any last minute questions for Alex?
I think I did have one, but I think we've answered it already. I was just like, where do you see it going? What's the next evolution? Or what should we be looking out for next?
So that's a really great question, and I genuinely, it's a great question because it's so hard because all of the pieces have existed for a long time for a really, really well featured and functional mobile malware piece, right? And I'm speaking about Androids because, the whole walled garden thing, but that'll eventually will get popped. So we're not going to separate the two of them. We'll just assume that it's going to happen. But all the pieces have existed for many years to make that a really bad threat to business and personal information. Yet it hasn't been, apart from Flubot, which Flubot did this damage. Don't get me wrong, Flubot did do a lot of damage, which was a piece of mobile banking malware, recently taken down. So that seemed to be where they were getting it together. But we talk about going back to names like Marcher and Exobot and Anubis, all these mobile pieces of malware that targeted banking platforms that never really got got going. Flubot seemed to do a bit of damage. The bit that I'm sort of thinking about next is we all use these fleet management softwares to push out software updates to our company's fleets and workstations, and now more and more mobile handsets. It's entirely possible that you can push out a piece of ransomware to your entire fleet of handsets. You know what I mean? Like all of the pieces exist for that to happen and have had for a long time. It just hasn't been done yet. But if you pop someone's fleet management software and push it out, you can all of a sudden lock up 20,000 mobile phones. That's pretty damaging to a business. I suppose you don't need to now because you can lock up 20,000 workstations. But I just think that, I don't know, it's just the fact that threat hasn't been realized on a large scale is very interesting to me. And I think maybe it's only a matter of time. I think we put a lot of trust in our handset manufacturers and our software platforms to do it right. But we've seen that most things can be subverted on a workstation basis, so it would make sense that maybe on a handset basis. But here we are, right?
Yeah. I mean, even that's evident, and then there's stories about even law enforcement going the other way when there's secure phones that are used by criminals, and then they're getting in and making backdoors to perform surveillance and that kind of thing, which is all sanctioned and good to catch the criminals. But I mean, that's a small scale thing. Like you're saying, the criminals could get in and do that to mobile platforms. Software is very rarely perfect, as we know. I think it's a question of having a will, I suppose, to do it. So I hope it doesn't happen, don't get me wrong, but it just seems like it's an interesting target for something like that. Yeah. Well, hopefully we didn't give them any ideas that they didn't. But that's a really good point to finish on, I think. So I just want to say thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. It was a pleasure talking to you and diving deeper into that presentation I saw you do at Adelaide Sec. Awesome. It was an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for your time. Awesome. Cheers, and thanks also to our listeners. You'll be able to find this recording and transcript along with more articles, information, and forums on forensicfocus.com.